when you're welcome everyone, and thank you for attending PERCoGS Fifth Symposium. I'm very pleased to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Brianne Gutmann. Dr. Gutmann is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Texas State University. Her previous research included the creation and evaluation of tools to support students' transitions into engineering physics from different physics backgrounds, specifically online mastery-style homework. Her current work focuses on creating curricula that engage undergraduates with the intersections of science and society, intended to support their ethical reasoning about these interactions. Dr. Gutmann is also involved in the Access Network, which is a national network of student-led groups which focus on improving equity in STEM. Today, Dr. Gutmann will present us her research project on factors which enable and limit student reasoning about ethics, science, and society in the classroom. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gutmann and wishing her good luck on her presentation.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. So I'll say hi again. I'm Brianne Gutmann. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the work we've been doing at Texas State to facilitate conversations about ethics, science, and society within the physics classroom and STEM classrooms in general. And so I will start by sort of asserting that science and society are connected. This is probably not a completely controversial statement, but it is sort of at odds with the way that science is often presented. So for example, there's sort of this notion that science is completely objective. There's no space for individuals' biases to get into science. That it's the solution to many, if not all, problems, and also sort of the assertion that science is not political. And this is sort of at odds with the history of science, which is, both historically and currently has been used to cause or perpetuate harm and sort of uphold these harms. And so in addition to this idea of science as being completely objective and impervious to bias, there's also some research that shows that this characterization of science, it can also encourage a disconnect from social responsibility. So I'm citing specifically some work by Erin Seck. So she saw that across 4 different institutions, that students over the course of their engineering degree, actually their sense of responsibility for social issues declined over that degree. And she argues that this disengagement is in part encouraged by this ideology of depoliticization of STEM. So sort of if you were expecting that the system is working perfectly, it's a meritocracy that is doing its job, then you have sort of this sense that it's not your job to sort of challenge that. And in addition to sort of disengaging students from feeling this connection to responsibility, students who do come in with a sense that they have aspirations to use science for social good or to improve society can also get the message that that's not the thing that they should be doing in this space. And so I'll say a couple of pieces about that. So in this book talking about Leaving Revisited, Elaine Seymour in her chapter notices that students of color and women represented 90% of students' altruistic reasons for entering STEM. So this is looking at why students enter STEM and then why students leave STEM. And then likewise, saw that they were also more likely to leave STEM for occupations where they felt that they could serve a social purpose. And so it's sort of also disproportionately affecting groups that are already underrepresented in STEM. And so specifically in physics, we saw that from the team up report from AIP that African-American students cited most often that they wanted to be able to apply their expertise from their major to their communities that they belong to. And sort of similarly, some work by McGee and Bentley saw that they saw from interviewing students that Latinx and Black college students often felt a tension between their desire to pursue STEM and give to their communities. So sort of coupled with the other side of this, students who are coming in not really thinking about these issues are given some justification to continue to not think about them. And students who do come in get this alienating message that this is not the space for them to do that. And so this is part of my motivation to be talking about ethics and science and society in the classroom. And I argue that science can be used for positive change. I'm not trying to argue that it's all gloomy, but more that it has to be something that's done intentionally. And in order for that to happen, we have to be validating that these connections are important and encouraging people to engage with them. And so the way that we are doing that at Texas State is trying to bring these conversations into science classrooms and specifically physics classrooms. And we're arguing that developing both motivation and skills to engage in ethical discussions about the societal impacts of STEM requires practice doing informed perspective taking, and also getting that validation that ethical reasoning is relevant to STEM. And so there is some work already doing this type of talking about ethics within science classrooms. Specifically, the ABET accreditation for engineering programs includes some ethics component, which is somewhat recent. And so there was a big push within engineering education to start including this. But there are also sort of two realms about how people are thinking about ethics. So there is sort of microethics, which is sort of the scope where you're thinking about your behavior within your professional community. So this would be sort of don't plagiarize, make sure you have good data integrity, don't steal from your colleagues or make sure you're citing your colleagues. But then there's also sort of the macroethics lens, which is sort of how does science then affect the larger picture and sort of how science is affecting society and how society is affecting science. And there are a lot of resources through APS talking about microethics. So there's sort of an ethics page, but this is focusing a lot on sort of professional practices and norms within the community. And the place that I'm interested in is this macroethics space. So thinking about how in the classroom we're talking about how we are impacting the larger society, because science is obviously a part of society, it's not separate. And in order to do that, we've been creating these units within our classes. And in order to understand sort of what is working and what is not and what can be better, we're using a framework of conjecture mapping. So this is sort of a simplified version of a conjecture map in terminology. So this is not the jargon, but there's sort of these classroom and curricular features are the first aspect. So this could be sort of what sort of exams you're using in your classes, who is teaching the class, sort of what the activities within the classes are. So if it's like group work versus a lot of individual work versus lecture. And also ideas that students are coming into the class with already. So some of these are under our control and some of these are not. But the conjecture map model says that all of these features lead into the interactions that happen in the classroom. And then these interactions lead to some desired outcome. So sort of in the context of our project specifically, if we're looking for the sort of vague outcome of students having an appreciation for these intersections and being proactive about thinking about the ways that they are interacting with society at large within their science spaces. We built our ethics units using some classroom and curricular features that we'd seen from other literature as being important. So for example, we embedded most of these units within the relevant physics unit. I'll give you some examples in a little bit. We included firsthand accounts from multiple stakeholders. We did this scaffolded perspective taking. We focused on small group discussions. And then we were also using ethical frameworks as a tool for students to do reasoning. So sort of if you're given a very large, vague, difficult question, it's hard to know where to start thinking about it. And so the purpose of the ethical frameworks is to give students some tools to start thinking about what is important to them and how that relates to the choices that people are making. And I see a question sort of about informed perspective taking. And this is something that a lot of folks have seen as being really important to building empathy, which I'll talk about more as well, but sort of prompting, this is just a fancy way of saying, we prompted students to say, like, what does this person care about? What does this person care about? Or what are they saying that they care about? What might be informing the decisions that they're making? So all of these features then lead to some interactions, and the data that we collected for these units is we collected video data of students while they're engaging in these discussions, and we also collected students' written work. And sort of the scope of where my research has gone so far is thinking about this left-hand side. So sort of what features are leading to what types of interactions. And so I'm going to give you sort of 3 different contexts that we did these units in at Texas State, and talk to you a little bit about what we learned in each of these spaces. So our first unit that we worked on was about the 30-meter telescope construction on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. So if you're unfamiliar with this, with this controversy, there have been moves to build a large telescope on a mountain in Hawaii that is sacred to many Native Hawaiians. And so there have been protests there for quite a long time. And we included this within an observational astrophysics course. So sort of embedding it into an elective course that students go into if they're interested in astrophysics. So trying to make it relevant to sort of their long-term goals or their interests. There are about 20 students in this course, and the units spanned, I think, 4 days. And this group of 4 people, we all designed this together. So this is not just me, this is a collaborative project. And we sort of broke it into a couple sections. So we started out the course by having students come up with norms for their discussions to think about how they want to talk to each other, because these things can sometimes get a bit heated. And we introduced them to the controversy if they were not yet familiar with it. And then we had students try to build an analogy with gentrification at Texas State with the 30-meter telescopes. This is not a perfect analogy, but we saw some parallels in that, it's sort of taking land from people for the sake of academic knowledge, and sort of thinking about ways that those analogies could line up in ways that they are different. And this is something that's really salient at Texas State, because San Marcos, where our campus has a really intense gentrification problem. So the college has been sort of eating up land and pushing people out. And so we followed this activity with students investigating the history of Hawaii. So this is sort of including the overthrow of their government and the annexation into the United States. And sort of giving some context, because this doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's sort of a continuation of a pattern that has been going on for a long time. And then we had students read some primary sources. So this included some perspectives from Native Hawaiians that were interviewed. So there was a big report about just where they went around and talked to a lot of people and then built it together. We read some accounts from some scientists who are both for and against the construction. So we were trying to get students to sort of see different people's perspectives. And then at the end, we had them connect that to some ethical frameworks. So we said, okay, now you've sort of built your ideas. How does this relate to some of the arguments that other people make for what is ethical or not? And how does that resonate with your own thinking, or what does not resonate? And so We ran this last spring. It's also running right now, spring 2021. And the results that I'm going to show you right now are from one of the students working on the project, Xander. This is the photo that he gave me. I love Xander. So he has presented on this work a couple times already. So he presented on this at the National Mentoring Community Conference, at SACNAS, and at APT. So I just want to kind of give him props, because this is a lot of the analysis that he did on the written work. And so looking at students' reflections at the end of the unit, he noticed a couple of themes, and we sort of dug into them. First of all, we saw that these firsthand accounts were successfully building empathy, or at least students were telling us that they were useful to them. So I'll give you a couple quotes from our students' reflections. So one student says, many of the local Hawaiians were describing the connection they had with the land and their experiences on the mountain. From this, I was able to connect my experiences visiting national parks in the US and my opinion that we should do what we can to preserve the beauty as found in their natural form. So this student is saying, there's something that I'm connecting to that I can relate to as well. Another student sort of speaks to this as well. They say, we could not possibly understand this until we experience or hear their testimonies ourselves. These types of connections have more value to us because they feel universal. So these two students are arguing, like, I can connect with what's going on here. And sort of the flip side of this, someone also cites this as being useful for understanding the limits of their own perspective. So this student says, I, along with, I would say, almost every other student in this class, as well as many other American people, do not know what it is like to be part of a deeply spiritual culture. And so this is sort of building empathy sort of from the other side of saying, like, this is where my perspective is limited, and so sort of giving some deference. Another theme that we noticed was the historical context and local analogies turned out to be fairly important to students. And so we saw, for example, one student says, one thing that really solidified my opinion, which was that we should not build the telescope, was the connection to colonialism. So they're sort of acknowledging that this larger context gave them tools to process this, and it affected their opinion. Another student said, when I first heard about this, I didn't think it could connect to colonialism, but I was definitely wrong. And then another student explicitly calls out again the historical events and making the analogy as both being important to them in thinking about this this controversy sort of in its perspective in the bigger picture. We also saw some students citing some openness to change and tendency towards compromise. So we saw a lot of students kind of gaining nuance that pushed them towards the middle as well. So this one student says, when I first heard about this, my thought process was along the lines of, what is more important than scientific discovery? But I think I have switched my position. Another student says they mostly fell on the side of the construction of the telescope because they understood how it could benefit astronomy. But looking at the gentrification analogy, the history of Hawaii, colonialism and imperialism, their standpoint is much more in the gray area. And we also saw people from the other side, so people who came in sort of really opposed to the construction, saying that I am more towards the middle than I was. So there was also an opportunity to do some perspective taking, right, for the other side, and understand what the arguments are for the construction. And one other really nice takeaway that we saw was sort of students embracing responsibility for the social impacts of astronomy. And so this student, this is a longer quote, she wants to be the director of an observatory, sort of when she finishes school. And so she's saying the potential for harm is always around. and I'll be working on this for the rest of my life. And so she's sort of embracing these responsibilities related to her future career. And so these are a lot of really nice takeaways. I'll give you some of the things that we noticed. So for example, we said that we saw that students acknowledging that the stakeholder accounts were helping them understand people's perspectives, and that the historical and local connections can establish context. And we also saw that we were able to sort of elicit students' personal responses. So they were able to sort of talk from their own perspectives and give their opinions. And okay. And so that was, again, sort of like, this is all the nice stuff. I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into one of our other units, which was our Manhattan Project unit. And so this unit focused on the development of the atomic bomb. And we
just before you do, there's a question for Megan in the chat. Are there any ways you wish the students acknowledge that you didn't see in their responses? Any takeaways?
That is a great question. Let me think on it and maybe come back to it at the end, because I don't have anything off the top of my head, but definitely this whole thing is like all in the same service. So let me mull on it in the back of my head while I talk. But thank you for letting me know. So the second unit was about, again, the building of the atomic bomb and sort of the roles of scientists around that time in both advocating for the research and advocating for dropping the bomb. And so this was within a modern physics class. This is the first upper division course in physics. So it's a required course for majors and minors. And again, we had this sort of broken up into different, like, quote unquote days or little mini units, and that spanned about 2 weeks. And so again, we started with setting some norms, and then students learned about the scientific principles, so sort of like fusion and et cetera, and how bonds are made and all of that stuff. And then from there, we went through students constructing a history and timeline of nuclear weapons, and sort of World War II and more broadly. And then we introduced an ethical framework. And so in this case, we gave students one ethical framework. It was Beauchamp's 4 principles for healthcare ethics. And so this is sort of, there are 4 different things that you should be keeping in mind, according to Beauchamp, in order to be behaving as ethically as possible. And then we had students, again, do some primary source readings and do discussions. And this often was sort of in the context of the 4 principles. And so again, just to give credit where it's due, all of the data that I'm showing you was collected by Egla. She graduated with her master's from Texas State last year, 2 years ago at this, like last December, I think. But yeah, so she was really instrumental in a lot of this work, and a lot of this video analysis she and I did together. So we sort of side by side watch things and then would discuss. And so a lot of this is also, I want to give credit to her. And in this sort of little chunk of the talk, I'm going to show you a couple of videos from one specific class period. And some of the questions that we were trying to answer with videos from this unit in general were sort of, what is enabling and limiting students in grappling with physicists' responsibilities to society? And then also sort of how students were positioning themselves as physicists or not, how that was influencing their engagement in grappling with those responsibilities. And so the clips that I'm going to show you are all from this set of students. And the reason that we chose these clips is that they spoke to these questions quite well. And we saw some really interesting conversations in here. And so I'll sort of introduce you to the main players. Primarily, we were following Alexa with this analysis. And she interacts a little bit with everyone, but a lot with Grant and some with the LA, Doug, and the instructor, Dr. Halsey. And so also because their identities sort of come up during this, I'll tell you that Alexa is white and Latina, and then Grant is a white man, Elise is a white woman, Jasmine is Latina, Kevin and the LA are both white men, and then Dr. Halsey is a white woman. And so I'm going to show you just sort of a couple of clips throughout the same class period where Alexa is trying to grapple with sort of her opinion on what happened with the Manhattan Project, and I'll give you some more specific prompts of what they're talking about. So in this first clip, we see the students are responding to a letter that they read where Einstein wrote to the president and argued we should be learning how to create an atomic bomb, essentially. And so we're asking, would you have made the same decision? Why or why not? And so I will let the video play. And I will also say, Alexa is going to have a side conversation with the LA, and there are going to be some other side conversations here, but I've only subtitled what's happening with Alexa and LA to try to make it easier to sort of keep track since there's two conversations going at the same time.
What about you? I'm currently brain dead. I don't know what I think.
Interesting. So, brain dead you, would you advocate the development of the atomic bomb?
I've never been put in this situation, so I can neither make a mistake.
Well, right now, just go with the gut. Yeah, sure.
I don't like this. It makes me
In your current position, would you advocate the development of the atomic bomb?
That's the point.
Of any similar scope to what Einstein did?
Like,
or anyone else?
What happens if we didn't kill all those people?
Even
Then
just say,
somebody
yeah,
really important
that's
could have
cool.
been there who
Do
could
what
have
you wanna do.
progressed us even further.
You also
Would you become
killed the next Hitler.
Would you go down to Washington and protest in the streets?
Like going into this, I mean, what perspective did you have? You say, like, yeah,
It'd be a confidential thing, so I might be worried about being imprisoned.
I never really had a strong advocacy for it because I never really thought about it.
Can't do it with this.
No, I don't think anybody should ever be harmed.
All right. And so some of the things that we were noticing as being both difficult and helping Alexa as she was thinking through her, how she feels about this is, first of all, she's expressing some discomfort around this task, in part because it's unfamiliar. And, but then she gets some support from the LA in this side conversation. And so he validates her discomfort. He talks a little bit about when he was in the class, which is, I think, maybe not in this clip, but and then he also gives her a stance that she can push against or agree with. So he says, okay, well, just gut reaction, would you advocate to drop the bomb? And so this helps Alexa start to articulate her values, where she says, no, I don't think anybody should be harmed. And then a few minutes later, the students are now responding to a different letter. Excuse me. So this is from a panel of scientists who had written to advocate for the dropping of the atomic bomb. And so it was sort of around the question, should we do a demonstration or should we actually drop it on Japan? And so this panel of scientists actually argued that it should be for real. But then at the end of the statement, they say, we have no special competence in solving political, social, and military problems which are presented by the advent of atomic power. And so I'll show you sort of the students' reactions to this.
I love the last line of this one. We have no competence in making political decisions. We're incompetent, so it's up to you guys.
Yeah, I think that's funny too.
That's the best way ever. Just claim no competence for every bad decision.
I'm a doctor,
Yeah, they're sort of like, we suggest
not
all
a
these things, but also
We're incompetent.
So in this clip, we notice Alexa sort of criticizing the scientists, and she's criticizing their abdication of responsibility of this for making a strong suggestion, but then also sort of tempering it at the end. And in this case, she gets some validation from the instructor. And so very, very shortly after this as well, they're still talking about the same excerpt, the same letter. And I'll let you watch this.
I prefer to check out into blissful ignorance and watch Netflix and cuddle with my dog.
You're just like these scientists.
Although that's
You're the
probably
reason the
worse.
atomic bomb was developed. You're the reason why the atomic bomb 2.0 is going to be developed.
No.
Because when they're
Don't
developing,
say
they write you a letter saying, hey, should we do it? You're like, I just want to cuddle my dog and watch Netflix.
They would not like send me a letter because I'm not that important.
You gotta wait. By the time World War III comes, you already won your Nobel Prize, your doctor of research at MIT. Why not?
Oh yeah,
And,
you've had my whole life figured out now.
Then they just write you that letter saying, hey, smartest person in the world, what should we do?
No,
You never know.
not me.
All right, so in this clip, sort of Alexa has just criticized the scientists, right, for wanting to step back from responsibility from this. But then she also is saying, I would just want to sit out, you know, and Grant really pushes on her. He's sort of saying, he's challenging her and saying, you're just like these other scientists, sort of hands-off responsibility. And she doesn't appear to like this, and she sort of argues that it's not the same thing because she's not that important. And in response to that, Grant pushes her to see herself as a scientist. He's sort of being like, you never know what things will be like in, 10 years from now. And then, so in this case, she's sort of detaching herself from responsibility by claiming that no one would be asking for her opinion. And also projecting that no one would be interested in her opinion, which is also interesting. So in the time between this clip and this next clip, I'll show you, Alexa has now made a firm stance. So she's very explicit that she thinks the bomb should not be dropped. She sort of sings a short song about it. And but then she offers up this reflection on this whole process. So this is sort of towards the end of the class. And I will play that for you.
I understand why, and it's easy for me to say I'm against it because I wasn't at the time. And obviously, if I was at the time, I'm a woman, I wouldn't even have an opinion. I'd probably be banned because I'm mixed, so I wouldn't have rights.
Yeah, and so sort of after the fact, she's reflecting on this, and she offers up this piece where she's saying that she doesn't feel that her race and gender would have, she acknowledges that her race and gender would have displaced her from this conversation historically as well. So she's saying it's easier for me to make an opinion now than if I had been at that time. And so sort of reflecting on this chain of short episodes, we notice some positive things happening still, that her peers, the learning assistant, and the instructor were all able to validate her in different ways. But we also see that she's expressing discomfort around having this conversation, and also that she was positioning herself as lacking agency both historically and currently. So she's sort of saying, in the context of the Manhattan Project, I wouldn't have had an opinion. People wouldn't have been asking for it. And in the clip before that, she's saying, nobody would ask me today. And so this sort of got us thinking, like, how can we be bolstering students' sense of agency for change in STEM while doing these small units? And so this was something that we were thinking about a lot in the context of designing this last class. So last fall, Alice Olmsted and I taught a course through the Honors College, specifically on ethics, science, and society. We sort of pitched it for any STEM student, but we got a lot of people to sign up who were not STEM students, which turned out to be really awesome. So we had some people in chemistry, in biology, but we also had people in criminal justice, in sociology and business. And so all of these perspectives sort of mushing together in one classroom. And sort of just if you're curious, we broke this class into 6 different mini units. So we started by talking about objectivity and sort of the social nature of science. We spent some time talking about redistricting, or sort of like the negative connotation of redistricting is gerrymandering, and sort of how mathematicians have contributed to that. We talked about pharmaceutical companies and capitalism, space exploration and colonialism, and we did a unit on human-centered machine learning, and then we closed out with a unit on intelligence testing. And so I'm going to give you just like 2 quick examples of courses that we ran, or of the mini units, to show you how we were trying to address this disconnect that we saw in the Manhattan Project. And so, for example, this first unit on redistricting and the politics of math. So we started out again by giving students the tools to understand sort of what's happening. So we talked about some of the strategies that are used in gerrymandering, so sort of cracking and packing in order to maximize your number of representatives. And then we also it was a very clear connection because this was about around the time of the election. And it was also the census. And so the census is really connected to how seats are assigned. So we were able to sort of connect, like, hey, did you see this, the census? You should do the census. And also there is a really extremely gerrymandered district. Let's see, from sort of like Austin all the way down to San Antonio, which most of the students live in. And so this is a gerrymander for Hispanic people, essentially. And so they're all crammed into one district from the city to the city. And so this was sort of a local context and a current context that students could grab onto and understand in the bigger, in the context of their lives beyond the class. We talked about the software that was sort of created for redistricting and then sort of blew up, and sort of thinking about how the people who created the software, whether or not they intended, how they intended it to be used, and whether or not they had control over that. We also highlighted some scientists who are doing this work. And so this is Dr. Cho, she's from the University of Illinois, and she does like some statistics stuff, and she does a lot of work about trying to identify districts as being intentionally gerrymandered versus just sort of ending up the way that they do. And so again, we're sort of highlighting the ways that STEM professionals are doing this. And I'll give you one more quick example. So one of our other units was around bias and human-centered machine learning. So there's sort of this perspective that, you know, if we switch everything to AI, you know, that's a way to reduce individuals' biases, but this also has the potential to sort of amplify systemic biases. And so we started out by kind of talking about how machine learning works on a very simple scale, how it shows up in their everyday lives, sort of facial recognition is one of them. And then we talked about a bunch of examples where this was intended to reduce bias, but actually made things much worse. And then the second half of this unit, we sort of did a deep dive into how machine learning is used in criminal justice. And so both for where police are sent, how sentencing happens, facial recognition and the use of facial recognition by the police. And this was sort of in line with the larger national conversation about police brutality within our country and police. And so again, we were trying to connect to things that students were already talking about and felt important, sort of beyond the scope of just a single class. And then we again tried to demonstrate or highlight, I guess, ways that the other scientists were engaging with this. So sort of there was a boycott by mathematicians to work on these algorithms, an article by a research scientist at Google. And then there are a bunch of different sort of subgroups that are also working on this. So the Algorithmic Justice League and AI Now are both sort of centers that are thinking about how so the social implications of artificial intelligence and facial recognition. And so again, trying to highlight these efforts by people that they may identify with as being scientists and entering that realm. And so sort of anecdotally from these discussions, we saw students talking often about their families and sort of their identities in general. We also saw students really eagerly wanting to know what people are doing about these issues and what they can be doing about these issues. And finally, we saw students often sort of positioning themselves in their career and thinking about how these things interact with their career. And so this is still anecdotal. We haven't dug into the recordings of this yet, but just from first glance, it seems like some things that went well are that these current and relevant issues can help students feel motivated to talk about these things. And then also that showcasing science activists can help students see paths for people to engage with this. And so sort of our next steps are that we have a lot of data on students still. There's so much video data, and we've also been thinking about how to bring faculty into this. So sort of not to put all of the burden on students, because we are all part of our community together, and thinking about how to both get instructors to want to talk about this and understand what makes it difficult and how we can support them in doing that, or that they can support each other. So just sort of thinking beyond students alone. And so I'm gonna skip these. So we're thinking about trying to build little instructor communities is this slide. So we're going to be running a workshop at this summer's APT, and we're hoping to use that to eventually sort of launch small groups of instructors that can support each other, because a lot of this is very context dependent. So it's not really a thing that's take and go, but more a thing of like, let's try to work with each other and support each other and thinking about how to do this well at our own institutions. I'll skip that. And so I will just say sort of the takeaways that I'm hoping that you're getting from this are that it's important for both junior and senior physicists to be thinking about this and how to facilitate and support each other in these conversations. But also that it's often very challenging, but that, again, we can support each other in doing it. So that is it, and thank you. If you have any questions, please ask me. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was like really very interesting discussion that we had. Like, I really enjoyed it. So there were a couple of questions on the chat. So Megan asks whether there are any takeaways, the question that Danny posed earlier, any takeaways you wish the students acknowledge that you did not see in their responses?
Yeah, I don't. Thank you for reminding me. I'm not sure that there's anything specific that I was angling for. I mean, I think some long-term goals that I have personally is to just sort of normalize talking about this. And I think that students, for the most part, were fairly comfortable talking about this. I mean, there, but despite small moments of discomfort along the way. But I don't know that there was anything specific that I was looking for. And honestly, I was really impressed with the nuance and the depth of students talking about this after having thought about it for a very short amount of time, because these are all really complex issues, and I feel like students oriented themselves really well to them. But if I think of something later on, I'll tell you. But there was nothing specific, I think, that I was looking for.
We have a new question from Jason. He says, what recommendations do you have for implementing issues of ethics in science and society into traditional STEM courses? These are important discussions, but can be difficult to weave into an existing course compared to building a new course. We have similar courses here at University of you. Which one?
Yeah, I think, I honestly think that
University of Utah, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly think that weaving them into existing courses is really great. Like, I think that there's sort of pros and cons to having the separate model versus the integrated one with like the little pieces along the way. And I think like you can dig into deeper if you have a course set aside, but I think that as far as sort of normalizing these conversations, having them be in classes where students are going to be, rather than like opting to choose into the separate space is really nice. And the way that we've been doing it is just sort of choosing topics that we feel like mesh with the content. And so sort of doing kind of a little after piece. So for example, the modern physics course with the Manhattan Project, we had students learning about nuclear physics and then go into these conversations. I know that Alice is teaching the course right now, and sort of informed by some of these takeaways, we were like, maybe it's not great to focus just on historical pieces. And so it's sort of morphed into a more like small things along the way, and thinking about like nuclear regulation now. So like it's easy to be like, oh, that was all in the 1940s, but there are still things, we still have nuclear weapons, and trying to think about what is happening here. And I think it's a little awkward at first, but once you sort of set that precedent, I think students oriented really well to it. And sort of we've been doing these at Texas State for long enough that students now come to expect it in the classes where they know that this happens. And so I think if there's anything specific that you want advice for, I'm happy to talk on it. But I think that the thing that is hardest is sort of breaking the norm in the first place. And once you've done it, it gets a lot easier from then on. And certainly you have to cut some material, right? That's always the trade-off. But I think it's a skill that students will also use in their lives, right? And I think that's, for people who are skeptical, I think that is a way that is sometimes convincing, is that most students are going to go into industry and otherwise, and they're going to be making these decisions. And if they've never had the practice or never had like a very low stakes space to do this sort of thinking in the context of their work, then it's it's all part of like building up a rounded preparation for your career, and it's applicable to many careers, of course, and not to imply that like students, of course, are doing ethical reasoning all the time, but not necessarily making the connection that this is something that's related to what they're going to do, and that this is something that can help them.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yeah, Danny?
I have one. I was at an event a few days ago, and I found out that here in Pittsburgh, the city police department was using predictive policing, which is like an algorithmic based, I'm sure you know what it is. And that there was sort of this activism that eventually caused them to stop using it. And so they went off to some other cities. So that made me wonder when I saw you were talking about it. So we have like scientists who are also activists, but then we also have like activists who are not sort of scientifically trained. And I'm wondering if there are connections, or like how you address or how you orient to people who are activists because this is affecting their lives or whatever else. And if that if that colors any of the discussions in any way.
Yeah, I think yes is the short answer. I think that we have sort of chosen to highlight scientists often because we want to sort of have our students feel that they are seeing themselves in these places, but certainly people are just asking generally like, well, what is going on with this? And regardless of whether or not they are STEM people, right? It's important to sort of show like these are the major players and what they're doing already. And I think that there's a lot of like building relationships across is very important. And I think you're also speaking to something that I want to pull on, which is sort of this like different groups of stakeholders. So thinking about, right, like activists versus scientists versus people who are both versus people who are neither. Like, I think that something that we've also noticed is that these roles are often blurred, right? Nobody is one specific thing. And that is something that we found also sort of useful to highlight. Like, for example, the 30-meter telescope is often sort of pitched as like it's scientists against Native Hawaiians, but there are Native Hawaiians who are scientists, and there are, you know, and it's sort of, and there are a lot of scientists, whether they're Native Hawaiians or not, who are against the building of the telescope, and there are also Native Hawaiians who are comfortable with it being built. So there's like a lot of variation in opinions within these groups, and sort of thinking about different stakeholders and trying to dig into the variation there. And so talking about scientists who are activists, I think is really valuable, but also talking about activists in general and scientists in general, like it's all a big pot, I guess.
I think we can take one or two small questions. Anybody has?
I have another question, unless someone else wants to go, but I was just wondering, are there like certain skills you have to have in order to have these discussions with the students? Like, do you have to, I don't know, be prepared in some sense as like, how do you prepare yourself as a professor for this?
That is a great question. I think there's sort of two pieces that I am thinking of. So there's sort of like the facilitating the discussion. So I think the norm building exercise is really important, and being comfortable doing that sort of building of collective norms is not obvious, right? Like it's so we've been using this Brave Spaces paper by Arau. There's probably other authors on there, but I think that's the first author. And we sort of use that one to think like, what are like the baseline things that we are hoping for this space? And then we let students come up with the norms, and then try to, if there's something like major that we think is still important, we might sort of nudge it. But students actually are really great at coming up with norms that work for them. So that is one piece, is sort of being able to handle like student conflict and like facilitate a conversation when the topic is perhaps a bit more heated or more difficult. I think that is something that you have to sort of mentally and emotionally prepare for. But for the most part, my anxiety about it was much more than like what actually happened. So I think like just as a take heart, like there's certainly, it can be intimidating, but it also is very rewarding, and students so far have been really fantastic. And then there's also the content. So like during my postdoc, I feel like all I've been doing is like learning history because you have to sort of know the context of what's going on. And like, I am not an expert on World War II, for example, right? But I'm talking about the Manhattan Project, which is embedded within that history. And so I think choosing something that you feel comfortable with, or that you feel fairly certain that you can build up enough knowledge to be able to understand what's important, is also a project. Like prepping for these units, I learned a lot. Like I didn't know a lot of the things that I did beforehand, and it was doable to sort of be like, this is a small piece that I'm going to focus on understanding, you know, like how machine learning and bias interact with each other, and like what have people been doing. But it's definitely a thing that I had to sit down and like really understand for myself first, which is not something that I automatically knew. I think if you have people who will work with you who are more expert in these topics, like that's obviously ideal. And so, for example, we got some feedback from some ethics professors about sort of our plans for doing this at Texas State. But I guess the short advice is like, be prepared to learn a lot of things, and also be prepared to ask people who know more than you, and also just sort of acknowledge if you don't know something, right? Like it's classic teaching advice anyways, but it certainly has tested like my understanding of society and the way that things are happening in current events in ways that I haven't had to be tested for many of my other teaching. But it's all, I think if you choose a topic that the scope is clean enough, you can get a good enough sense of what's going on to at least be able to scaffold some conversations, even if sometimes the answers are, I'm not positive.
I have a question. I hope it's short. So I was wondering whether within a single course, do you present, like, do you introduce those discussions on ethics multiple times, or it's just one time in a single course?
Yeah, so in modern physics now, I know Alice is doing some like multiple part, like throughout the thread of the course. All of the other ones that we've been doing were mostly confined to a single topic and a single unit, primarily because of what I was saying to Megan, which is that like it requires you to kind of dig in, and there's sort of, you know, how much can you absorb it and process and then try to help other people think about within a short amount of time. But I think a better model is what you're describing, with which is like sort of introducing this norm early on and then sort of revisiting it throughout. I think that would be ideal. It just requires more time. And so now that we've iterated on this a couple times, for example, she has some more space to sort of be like, okay, well, what are some other things that we could do with this?
And have you observed like a difference in student engagement across, you know, traditional sessions versus those sessions on ethics?
I think honestly people are more excited. Like, so when I started teaching modern, Alice had taught it the semester before me, and basically the first thing everyone asked me is like, when are we going to do the ethics stuff? So like I think people are excited about it because it's different, and it's more, it's less, I don't know, you end up doing a lot of the technical stuff. It's nice to sort of stretch that other part of your brain in that space.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Are we ready to wrap up? Unless anyone has a question? Yeah, okay. Brianne, I want to thank you so much for accepting this invitation and presenting this great work with us. It was really, really interesting. And yeah, thanks for presenting here.
Yeah, thank you all. And thank you for your great questions.
I just want to remind everyone that our next symposium talk will take place on May 24th, and the speaker will be Laura Rios. So you'll be receiving a notification. Well, thanks everyone.